Imagine a pain that begins not with a cut, but with a touch, a gentle warmth that quickly betrays you, escalating into a blistering heat that seems to radiate from your very bones. Imagine a torment that doesn't tear your skin, but melts it. A slow, relentless consumption where your own flesh dissolves around you and your world dissolves into a screaming, scalding agony. This is not a nightmare plucked from some forgotten mythology. This was a sentence handed down by a king in the heart of one of the most civilized nations on earth. To understand how a man could be condemned to be boiled alive, you must first understand the world that conceived of such a punishment. Welcome to the court of King Henry VIII. It is a world of glittering jewels and magnificent palaces, of soaring ambition and Renaissance poetry. But beneath the velvet and silk, there is a current of deep gnawing paranoia. This is a kingdom held together by the will of a single, increasingly unstable man, a king obsessed with his legacy, desperate for a male heir, and pathologically terrified of betrayal. And in the gilded halls of the Tudor court, one weapon was feared above all others, not the sword, the weapon of a nobleman, not the dagger, the tool of a common assassin. The most feared weapon was poison. Poison was the great equalizer. It was silent, insidious, capable of bypassing armies and castle walls. It could be hidden in a splash of wine, a pinch of salt, a spoonful of porridge. It was seen as the weapon of cowards, of schemers, of foreigners, of women. To Henry, whose grip on power and whose very bloodline felt perpetually under threat, the thought of poison was not just a fear. It was an obsession. It represented the ultimate internal betrayal, a rot that could destroy his kingdom from the inside out. Our story begins not in the king's palace, but in the kitchens of a powerful and respected man, John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. Bishop Fisher was a man of staunch principle and unwavering faith, qualities that made him increasingly dangerous in Henry's eyes. He was one of the Queen, Catherine of Aragon's, most vocal supporters, openly defying the king's quest for a divorce. He was a pillar of the old Catholic order, a rock against which the waves of Henry's Reformation were beginning to crash. His household was a hub of political and religious activity, a place of power, influence, and now, a crime scene. On February 18, 1531, a simple pot of porridge was prepared in the bishop's kitchens in Lambeth, London. It was meant for the bishop's household and for the local poor who gathered at his gates for charity. But a guest had been invited to this meal, an uninvited guest hiding within the simmering oats. It was a fine white powder, slipped into the pot when no one was looking. This single, simple act would set in motion a chain of events so bizarre and so brutal, it would lead to the creation of a law written in rage and a punishment so horrific. It stands as a grim monument to the paranoia of a king and the agony of one unfortunate man. The porridge was about to be served, and with it, a new definition of horror was about to be written into English law. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was the taste. The porridge, usually a bland but nourishing meal, was described as having a strange, bitter flavor. But in an age before a deep understanding of food safety and in a household where charity was a duty, the meal was consumed. The effects were almost immediate. A wave of violent illness swept through the Bishop of Rochester's household. People doubled over, gripped by agonizing stomach cramps. The kitchens and halls of the stately home were filled with the sounds of retching and groans of pain. The poison was not a subtle one. It was a brutal, fast-acting agent that turned a simple meal into an instrument of torture. Panic erupted. Of the many who ate the porridge that day, 2 men died in horrific circumstances. One was a gentleman of the household named Bennet Curran. The other was a poor widow who had come to the bishop's gate seeking charity. Many others were left violently, desperately ill, their bodies racked by the poison for days. The city of London was gripped by a wave of fear. If a man as powerful and as holy as the Bishop of Rochester could be targeted in his own home, then who was safe? Poison was a phantom, and now it seemed it could be anywhere, even in a charitable bowl of porridge. The investigation, if you could call it that, was swift and decisive. Suspicion immediately fell upon one man, Richard Roos, a cook within the bishop's household. He was arrested, and the case seemed open and shut. He was the cook. He had access. He was the logical culprit. But it was under questioning that this seemingly simple case took a bizarre and deeply unsettling turn. Rose did not deny his involvement. He confessed. He admitted, under what was likely extreme duress, that he had been the one to introduce the fine white powder into the pot. A confession should have been the end of the matter, a neat conclusion to a terrifying crime. But the details of his confession did not suggest a cold-blooded killer. They suggested something far stranger, either a monumental fool or a pawn in a much larger, more sinister game. According to his testimony, Rose claimed he had not acted with murderous intent. He said the powder had been given to him by a mysterious stranger, a man he identified only as a Mr. Cromwell's man, in some accounts, a detail that was either a fabrication or a terrifyingly dangerous accusation. This stranger, Rose claimed, had assured him that the powder was not a poison, but a simple, harmless substance. It was, the man had told him, a jape, a practical joke. He said it was a powerful laxative, a purgative that would cause some temporary discomfort and embarrassment for the household, but nothing more. It was just a prank, a bit of kitchen humor. This confession raises a cascade of disturbing questions that hang over the case to this day. Was Richard Roos telling the truth? Was he truly naive enough to believe that a stranger would give him an unknown powder to put in his master's food as a simple jape? In the paranoid atmosphere of a Tudor kitchen, where rivalries were common and punishments were severe, such an act of foolishness seems almost unbelievable. Or was he lying? Was the story of the stranger a desperate, clumsy attempt to save his own skin, an effort to minimize his crime by claiming he was an unwitting dupe? Perhaps he was the poisoner, acting on his own motives, a personal grudge, a petty grievance, a secret that has been lost to history. But then there is a third, more chilling possibility. What if he was telling the truth? What if there really was a stranger? If so, who was he and who sent him? The case is thrown wide open, transforming from a simple murder into a possible political conspiracy. And the most glaring clue is the man who wasn't harmed that day. Bishop John Fisher, the master of the house and the most powerful man on the premises, did not eat the porridge. Due to his advanced age and frail health, he was fasting or had abstained from that particular meal. If the goal was to assassinate the bishop, a man who was becoming a major thorn in the side of King Henry VIII's plans for divorce, then the plot was a catastrophic failure. Did the assassin simply have bad luck? Or was the target never the bishop at all? Some historians have theorized that the true target may have been the household itself, an act of political terrorism designed to intimidate Fisher and his supporters. By attacking his home, killing his staff, and terrorizing his dependents, an enemy could send a powerful message without directly harming the bishop, thus maintaining a degree of plausible deniability. In this scenario, Richard Roos was exactly what he claimed to be, a pawn. He was the perfect scapegoat, a simple-minded cook who could be easily manipulated into delivering the poison, and who would be the first to fall when the investigation began. His story of a Jap was the cover, the lie he was told to ensure he would carry out the act without suspicion. The identity of the stranger, if he existed, remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The mention of Mr. Cromwell's man in some early, though perhaps unreliable, accounts is tantalizing. At this time, Thomas Cromwell was rising in the king's favor, a ruthless political operator who would stop at nothing to achieve his master's will. Was this an early, unsanctioned attempt by one of his agents to remove a political obstacle? Or was Rose simply naming a powerful and feared man in a desperate attempt to create a conspiracy so large he might get lost in it? We will likely never know the truth. The investigation stopped with Richard Roos. No serious attempt was made to find the mysterious stranger. The authorities had their man. Their confession, and their scapegoat. The complexity, the contradictions, the lingering questions, none of it mattered. Because this case was no longer about finding the truth behind a botched poisoning. It was about to become a canvas upon which a furious king was about to paint his masterpiece of rage and absolute power. Richard Roos, whether a fool, a murderer, or a pawn, was about to become horribly irrelevant. His fate was sealed, not by the evidence of his crime, but by the paranoia of his king. The news of the Lambeth poisoning traveled swiftly from the bishop's kitchens to the king's court, and when it reached the ears of Henry VIII, it found the most fertile ground imaginable for paranoia and rage. To understand what happened next, you must understand the mind of the man on the throne in 1531. This was not the confident, athletic young Henry who had inherited the kingdom. This was a king teetering on the edge of a midlife crisis of epic, nation-shattering proportions. He was a man besieged not by foreign armies, but by his own anxieties. His primary obsession was what he called his great matter. He was desperately trying to secure an annulment from his wife of over 20 years, Catherine of Aragon, who had failed to produce a male heir. His desire was not just for a new wife, the alluring Anne Boleyn, but for the continuation of his dynasty, the very security of his kingdom. This quest had put him on a collision course with the most powerful institution on earth, the Catholic Church. The Pope was refusing to grant the annulment, and Henry was being pushed further and further toward a complete seismic break with Rome. This political and religious turmoil created a feverish atmosphere of conspiracy. Every shadow in the court could hide a papal agent, a Spanish spy, an assassin loyal to Queen Catherine. And at the forefront of the domestic opposition stood Bishop John Fisher. Fisher was not just a dissenting voice, he was a symbol of defiance. He was learned, internationally respected, and utterly unshakable in his belief that the king's marriage was valid in the eyes of God. He was a constant public rebuke to the king's will. Into this cauldron of anxiety, ambition, and religious strife, the story of the poisoned porridge landed like a lit match. For Henry, this was not just a domestic crime, it was a terrifying omen. The fact that it had occurred in the household of his chief political opponent was almost irrelevant. What he saw was the method. Poison. The silent, cowardly weapon that could bypass his guards, his food tasters, his entire apparatus of security. If the Bishop of Rochester could be targeted, then who was to say the king himself was not next? In his mind, the act of poisoning was not just murder. It was a form of treason. It was an attack on the natural order, an assault on the very concept of a divinely ordained hierarchy. A common cook, in this view, had used a secret, almost magical power to usurp the power of life and death, a power that belonged to God and to his chosen king alone. Henry's reaction was not that of a measured statesman seeking justice. It was the visceral, explosive rage of a tyrant who feels his control slipping. He saw the existing laws for murder, typically hanging, as woefully inadequate. A simple death was not enough. The punishment had to match the insidious, terrifying nature of the crime. The sentence had to be so spectacularly horrific that it would burn the very thought of using poison out of the minds of his subjects for a generation. This was not about justice for Richard Roos. It was about making an example of him. He was to be a human billboard, a walking, screaming advertisement for the king's absolute power. Driven by this personal fury, Henry VIII took an extraordinary and almost unprecedented step. He intervened directly in the legislative process. He went before Parliament himself, not just as a king, but as a lawmaker, a man dictating the very terms of justice. In a matter of weeks, a new, terrifying piece of legislation was drafted and forced through Parliament, a law that would forever be tied to this single case. It was officially titled an Act for Poisoning, but it would become known as the Boiling Act of 1531. This act was a legal monstrosity, a piece of legislation written not in ink, but in blood and paranoia. It was tailor-made to destroy one man, Richard Roos, and it violated several core principles of what was then considered English justice. First, the law was made retroactive. It was an ex post facto law, meaning it made an action illegal or increased the punishment for it after it had already been committed. When Rose allegedly poisoned the porridge, the prescribed punishment was hanging. This new law reached back in time to subject him to a horror that did not legally exist when he committed his crime. It was a complete perversion of the legal process, a clear sign that this was not about law, but about royal vengeance. Second, the act elevated the crime of poisoning to the level of high treason. This was a crucial legal maneuver. Murder, even mass murder, was a felony. But treason was a crime against the king himself, against the very fabric of the state. By redefining the crime this way, Henry was framing the Lambeth poisoning as a direct attack on his authority and the stability of his realm. It allowed him to treat the poisoner not as a common criminal, but as an enemy of the state, deserving of the most extreme and exemplary punishment. And third, the act prescribed that punishment. It was a penalty unheard of in English common law, a horror imported from the continent, a torment designed for maximum public spectacle and unimaginable agony. The act declared that Richard Roos and any who followed him in the crime of poisoning would be committed to execution of death by boiling. The statute even stipulated that they should be boiled without any advantage of clergy, legal clause that removed the traditional right of clerics to be tried in a more lenient church court. No one would be safe. The Boiling Act of 1531 was a legal anomaly. It was a snapshot of a king's rage, a law born from a single man's paranoia. Henry VIII had looked at the existing legal system and found it wanting. He had found its punishments too tame, its processes too slow. And so, with the full force of his royal will, he had bent the entire legislative might of England to his purpose. He had created a new category of traitor and invented a new kind of death just for them. The stage was now set. The law was in place. All that was left was the public performance, a horrifying spectacle designed to demonstrate to the entire kingdom the terrifying consequences of waking the wrath of the king. The fate of Richard Roos was now sealed, not by a jury of his peers, but by the personal decree of his king. He had been denied a conventional trial, his guilt declared by an act of Parliament itself. He was no longer a man, he was a symbol. He was the embodiment of a crime so heinous in the king's eyes that it required a punishment designed to scar the public memory. And the stage for this gruesome lesson was to be Smithfield. Smithfield, on the outskirts of London, was a place of jarring contradictions. By day, it was a bustling, chaotic livestock market, a place of commerce filled with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares and the lowing of cattle. But it was also London's primary stage for public death. It was here that heretics were burned at the stake, where traitors were drawn and quartered, where the state performed its most brutal acts of retribution in front of a curious and often jeering populace. Public executions in Tudor England were not solemn affairs. They were a form of mass entertainment, a civic ritual, a raw and visceral piece of social theater. And the execution of Richard Roos was destined to be the most shocking performance of the season. On April 5, 1531, a great crowd gathered at Smithfield. They came from all corners of the city, drawn by the morbid promise of a death never before seen on English soil. In the center of the square, the instrument of this new form of justice had been erected. It was not a gallows, nor a chopping block, nor a pyre. It was something far more mundane, and in its domestic familiarity, infinitely more disturbing. A massive iron cauldron, a great pot large enough to hold a man, fixed over a roaring fire. The chroniclers of the time captured the scene. As Richard Roos was dragged from the Tower of London to the site, he was met with a wall of noise, the hum of thousands of spectators eager to witness his end. He was brought before the simmering cauldron, a man already condemned by law and public opinion. There was no final speech, no moment of defiance or plea for mercy recorded. He was simply the lead actor in a play whose gruesome finale had already been written by the king. What? Happened next was a masterclass in calculated cruelty, a slow, agonizing process designed to maximize suffering in public display. Rose was not simply thrown into the boiling water. That would have brought the swift release of death from shock. The executioners had devised a method to prolong the ordeal, to make every moment a new peak of agony. According to the Chronicle of the Grey Friars of London, a contemporary account, Rose was bound with chains and attached to a gibbet, a crude crane-like structure fixed over the pot. With the crowd watching in stunned silence, the condemned man was slowly, deliberately lowered into the cauldron. The first immersion was likely brief, plunging him into the scalding water up to his waist. The shock and the searing pain would have been instantaneous, producing a scream that would have echoed across the market square. Then he was hoisted up again, his lower body boiled red, steam rising from his tormented flesh. He was left dangling, exposed to the cool spring air, a torment in itself, as the contrasting temperatures would have sent new waves of agony through his system. This horrific cycle was repeated. He was lowered again, a little deeper this time, then raised, then lowered again. Each dip was a fresh hell, the waterline climbing higher up his body, cooking him alive by degrees. An eyewitness, as recorded in the Chronicle of William Gregory, described the scene with chilling simplicity. He was locked in a chain and pulled up and down in a cauldron of water until he was dead. Another account suggests the entire process took nearly 2 hours. 2 hours of being systematically boiled, of consciousness fading in and out, of his skin blistering and peeling away from the muscle, of his organs slowly cooking inside his body. The crowd, which may have arrived seeking a grisly thrill, was reportedly stunned into a horrified silence by the sheer, protracted brutality of the spectacle. They were witnessing a form of torture so extreme it transcended the normal bounds of public execution. This was not justice. This was a sermon preached with fire and boiling water. The message, dictated by Henry VIII, was brutally clear. This is what happens when you threaten the established order. This is the consequence of raising your hand against the powerful. This is the fate that awaits those who deal in the secret, cowardly art of poison. Henry was using Richard Roos's body as a parchment upon which to write his new law of terror. The agonizing 2-hour death of this one cook was intended to echo in the memory of every person who witnessed it, a story to be told and retold in every tavern and marketplace in the kingdom. The theatricality of the event was its entire purpose. By choosing such a novel and visceral punishment, Henry ensured the story would spread. A hanging was common. Being boiled alive was unforgettable. It was a brand seared into the nation's psyche. The king was demonstrating in the most public and gruesome way possible that his power was absolute. He could not only take a life, but he could also redefine the very manner of death. He could reach into the depths of human cruelty and fashion a new punishment to fit his royal rage. At Smithfield that day, the law was not a shield for the innocent or a sword of justice. It was a cauldron, and it was filled with the king's fury. Richard Rose was merely the first to be consumed by it. The horrifying spectacle at Smithfield achieved its immediate goal. The story of the cook who was boiled alive spread like wildfire through London and beyond, a gruesome fable carrying a potent royal warning. The unique cruelty of the punishment ensured its place in the public consciousness, creating precisely the kind of chilling deterrent that King Henry VIII had intended. But what of the law that had made it possible? The Boiling Act of 1531 was a legal weapon of immense and unusual power. One might expect such a tool, once forged, to be used frequently by a king known for his ruthlessness. Yet, the legacy of this infamous act is as strange and specific as its creation. The Boiling Act was not the beginning of a new era of culinary punishments in England. It was an anomaly, a legal outlier that was used only a handful of times after the execution of Richard Roos. Its extreme nature made it a tool for only the most specific circumstances, a weapon too monstrous for everyday use. History records only two other certain cases where this horrific sentence was carried out. The most well-documented of these occurred in 1542. A young servant girl from King's Lynn, named Margaret Davy, was accused of using poison to murder her mistress. In a dark echo of the ruse case, she was found guilty under the terms of the Boiling Act. In March of that year, she too was taken to a public square and boiled to death for her crime. The law, it seemed, was not just for men. A woman could also be subjected to its full, agonizing horror. Another case is recorded in the private diary of a London citizen, noting a man being boiled in the street for poisoning his wife. Beyond these few instances, the law seems to have fallen into disuse, even during Henry's own lifetime. This rarity suggests that the act was never truly intended to become a standard part of the English legal system. It was, first and foremost, a reaction. It was a piece of performative legislation, a reflection of one king's personal obsessions and his flair for the dramatic. Henry had made his point. He had demonstrated his absolute power over law and life, and having done so, the tool itself became less necessary. The memory of the cauldron was enough. The final verdict on the Boiling Act came swiftly after its creator had left the world. When Henry VIII died in 1547, and his young son, Edward VI, ascended to the throne, one of the very first acts of the new Protestant-led government was to repeal the most extreme and tyrannical laws of Henry's later reign. In the first year of Edward's rule, the Parliament passed the Treason Act of 1547. This new law was a sweeping reform designed to undo the legal excesses of his father. It dramatically reduced the number of crimes that could be considered high treason, and in doing so, it specifically abolished the Boiling Act of 1531. The law that had been born of Henry's personal fury died with him. Its repeal was a quiet admission by the English legal establishment that boiling a human being alive was a step too far, a punishment that belonged not in a civilized code of law, but in the realm of despotic rage. Its brief 16-year existence was a testament to its true nature. It was not a law for England, it was a law for Henry. And what of the man whose death had inspired it all? What is the final legacy of Richard Roos? As the echoes from the cauldron faded, the questions surrounding his case remained. Was he a cold-blooded killer who murdered two innocent people over a petty grudge? Was he an unbelievably naive fool who fell for a deadly prank? Or was he a tragic pawn, a scapegoat sacrificed to satisfy a king's paranoia and send a political message? History offers no definitive answer, and in this ambiguity lies the final chilling lesson of his story. If he was guilty, his punishment was a form of cruelty that far outweighed his crime, transforming him from a simple murderer into a symbol of state-sanctioned torture. If he was innocent, or merely a pawn, then his fate is even more terrifying. It means a man was subjected to one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable, not because of his own actions, but because he was a convenient tool in a larger political game. His guilt or innocence became secondary to his usefulness as a public spectacle. The case of the poisoned porridge was never truly solved. The mysterious stranger, if he ever existed, was never found. The possibility of a high-level conspiracy to intimidate or assassinate Bishop Fisher was never investigated. The legal system, hijacked by the king's personal agenda, focused solely on the cook. It needed a villain for its public drama, and Richard Roos was cast in the part. His story is a disturbing reminder of how easily the machinery of justice can be twisted to serve the whims of the powerful. It shows how, in an atmosphere of fear and paranoia, the demand for a swift, satisfying conclusion can overwhelm the search for truth. Richard Roos was a nobody, a simple cook who stumbled into the crosshairs of a king's deepest anxieties. As a result, his name is now forever linked to one of the most bizarre and brutal punishments in legal history. He is remembered not for his life, but for the horrifying manner of his death, a death that tells us less about his own guilt and more about the terrifying nature of the man who condemned him. The story of Richard Roos is a grim footnote in the grand, blood-soaked saga of the Tudor dynasty. His tale is often overshadowed by the larger dramas of beheaded queens, religious reformation, and royal succession. But in this one, strange, horrifying case, we find the very essence of Henry VIII's rule, distilled down to its most brutal components. This is a story that began with a pot of porridge and ended with a law written in a king's rage. It is a story about how the personal anxieties of one man can reshape a nation's definition of justice. Richard Roos, the man, is almost lost to history. We will never know for certain if he was a cold-blooded murderer, a reckless fool, or the tragic pawn in a game far beyond his comprehension. But in the end, his individual guilt is almost beside the point. The true horror of this story lies not in the act of poisoning, but in the state's reaction to it. It lies in the terrifying ease with which a system of law can be perverted, twisted from a shield that protects society into a personal weapon of vengeance for the man who holds the crown. The cauldron at Smithfield was more than just an instrument of execution. It was a piece of political theater. It was a declaration by Henry VIII that his power was absolute. He could not only dictate the laws of the land, but he could also invent new and terrible ways to die, custom-made to fit his royal fury. The slow, agonizing death of Richard Roos was a message sent not just to other potential poisoners, but to every subject in the realm. It was a demonstration that the king's wrath was boundless and his imagination for cruelty was limitless. This story serves as a chilling case study in the nature of tyranny. It shows us that the greatest atrocities are often born not from cold, calculated policy, but from the hot, unpredictable emotions of a single, powerful individual. It was Henry's personal obsessive fear of poison and betrayal that led to the Boiling Act. The law was a projection of his own internal demons onto the legal code of his nation. The tales that have been passed down from this dark period of history often feel distant, like grotesque fables from another world. But the themes they contain are timeless. The abuse of power, the sacrifice of justice for the sake of political messaging, and the willingness of a society to accept shocking acts of cruelty in the name of order. These are not just stories from the Tudor era. They are etched into the very fabric of human history. Our purpose here is to unearth these forgotten stories, not for the sake of horror, but for the sake of memory. The stories of individuals like Richard Roos, caught in the gears of a merciless state, are the ones that are most easily erased. They are the footnotes, the anomalies, the uncomfortable reminders of how fragile justice can be. But they are also the most important. They show us the true cost of absolute power. If you believe that these stories must be remembered, that we must continue to shine a light into the darkest corners of our past to understand the present, then you are part of our mission. The conversation doesn't end here. Share this story, discuss the questions it raises, and let us know in the comments which other forgotten life or which other brutal law you think needs to be brought out of the shadows. Because only by remembering the fates of those who were consumed by the whims of tyrants can we hope to guard against the echoes of their rage in our own time.